Hi there, and welcome to the 5th video in the Trauma Survival Guide. And in this episode, I want to talk about the topic of young people and sexual trauma. When I think about how the world has changed in my own lifetime, two of the major things that come to my mind are the advancements in digital technology and access to the internet, and the increasing sexualization of our world today. I think these two things are very deeply linked one to the other, because in previous generations, if somebody wanted to find pornographic content, they would have to go hunting amongst magazines on the top shelves of bookshops and newsagents. But in today's world, with all the developments in technology and the internet, then sexual content, and very often very extreme sexual pornographic content, is available to any one of us with just a few clicks of a button on our smartphones or tablets or personal computers. And in the same way, anyone who wants to explore sexual fantasies and fetishes can very easily link up with like-minded people online and share images and videos that are explicit. So the world that we are raising our children and young people in today is very different from the world that many of us grew up in. And it's a world that is saturated with sexual content. And I think that it's really important for us to think about the impact that this is having on our young people. So I just want to say that in this video, I have no intention of being moralistic or judgmental. I don't want to tut and bemoan the shortcomings of young people today. I just simply want to stand back and look at the reality of what's happening around us, and how maybe all of us have played a part in creating a culture that is emotionally damaging for our children and young people. So I'm going to, in this video, look at 2 points where I think there's an intersection between trauma and the sexualization of our culture. And the first of these points is the exposure of young children to pornography. I did a little bit of research over the last few days, and I found 3 studies. One was from the US that was just done this year, and it found that the average age for young children to be exposed to pornographic content in the US is just 12 years old. A study done last year in the UK found the average age to be 13 years old, and that by the age of 18, 79% of young people have encountered violent pornography. The study that I found that was done in Israel was actually the most shocking of all of them, and it said that Israeli children, the average age that an Israeli child is exposed to pornography is just 8 years old. And that by the age of 13, 80% of children have seen pornography. When you look at these figures, it becomes clear that pornography is something so pervasive that children can't just opt out. It's not something that happens that they would have to search for and have special meetings or go somewhere specific to see some of this content. It's things that they might see just on the school playground, that as children have their own smartphones, as many do. They're the sorts of images that might just be circulating on their WhatsApp groups with their other friends. So the question then is, what impact does this exposure to pornography have on young children? And when I did my second video in this series on the definition of trauma, I spoke about trauma being any event or series of events that overwhelms our abilities to cope, that overwhelms our nervous systems, that exceeds our resources and support systems, and it's something that puts us out of control. So this could be anything that is too fast, too prolonged, too frightening, too much. And another very key part of this definition is trauma can be something that happens too soon. So this could be something that maybe we wouldn't find traumatic if we were a little bit older, a little bit better prepared, a little bit wiser, a little more experienced. But because it happens at a point where we're just not ready for it, then it's a trauma for us. And young people, children's exposure to pornography falls very much into this category of too soon. Because the fact is, young children's brains are not developmentally ready to understand and process sexual content, and particularly not the violent and explicit sexual content that has become very mainstream in the porn industry. So what happens when a child's brain encounters this sort of imagery that they're just not ready for and not able to process? What happens is that a neural pathway develops between sex and fear. So sex, rather than being associated with something pleasurable and intimate and safe and relational, it becomes associated with fear, loss of control, and very often, because so many of the images involve abuse and violence, then sex becomes associated with aggression and violence. And I think it doesn't take much to think what these neural pathways and what these associations do for the children as they grow up and start forming their opinions of the world, themselves, their bodies, their relationships, and then as they branch out into their own sexual experiences. This early impact is huge. The other intersection between young people and the sexualization of our culture that I think is very much linked to the first one I've just spoken about is the fact that traumatic sexual experiences have become normal among young people. And again, I just want to repeat what I said at the beginning of this video, that the purpose here isn't to point the finger and to shame and blame young people for any of their sexual practices. It's simply to stand back and look at how this sexual landscape is affecting the well-being of young people. So when I speak to young people today and when I read some of their accounts and testimonies, a theme that really comes across is that there are certain ideas and expectations about what is normal in the area of sex and relationships, and that no one wants to be seen to be different or abnormal in this area. There's a sort of irony that at first glance it might look like today's sexual landscape is more liberal than ever and more accepting of differences and individual choices. The truth is that only certain freedoms and choices are accepted as normal and other ones are ridiculed. So anyone who holds on, for example, to a belief that sex is healthiest and best practiced within a committed marriage relationship would be wide open to ridicule. The problem is that many of the accepted norms for what's acceptable and what's to be expected in the realm of sex and relationships come straight out of the porn industry, where a lot of young people get their education about sex. One of these norms is that there should be a disconnect between sex and intimacy. So there's the general idea that people should be able to engage in sex without having any sort of emotional entanglements, and therefore those who struggle to do this and find their hearts get entwined are seen as somehow abnormal, weak, different. There's something wrong with them. And And another thing that's come in largely from the porn industry into young people's sexual practices into the mainstream is the whole realm of sexual fetishes and also violent sexual practices. And the truth is that a lot of these things that are just seen as normal parts of sex and relationships are in themselves inherently traumatic. But young people very often don't identify that there are parts of this sexual landscape that are traumatic because they're more likely to blame themselves and think there's something wrong with them if they have a problem with any of this that's happening. So if a young person didn't want to engage in some of the fetishes or some of the violent practices, they might be open to criticism by others that they're prudish or that there's something wrong with them. I was struck, I read recently an article by someone who works as a counsellor in a UK university, and I was really shocked and saddened by what this woman wrote. She said that in recent years, there's a huge increase of young women who have come to her complaining of symptoms of depression, anxiety, maybe issues focusing on their studies. So she's begun to address these issues with them. And it's only been after many, many meetings far down the process of counselling that they've begun to share their relationships and their sexual experiences. And the counsellor has realised that these women have actually been subject of rape or sexual abuse. And what has struck her is that these young women themselves haven't identified and can't see that they have actually been raped. That they're more likely to think that their problem is some mental health issue that they have, rather than identifying what's actually going on, which is that they have experienced a violent sexual trauma and that their mental health system, symptoms of depression, anxiety and other things, are their body and mind responding to trauma. I think that sometimes I get angry when I hear members of the older generation judging and condemning young people for their mental fragility. You hear sort of put downs and insults like, oh, this is a generation of snowflakes, they just need to toughen up, they just need to learn some resilience. And also in faith communities, there's often a lot of blame and shaming for the promiscuity and the sexual deviance of young people today. But I feel very strongly that all of us need to, rather than just blaming these young people who really have been groomed since early childhood into a view of sex and relationships that is deeply toxic, I think it's the responsibility for all of us to really stand back and think about the world we're living in, what this sexual saturation is doing, and how we can make it a safer place for our youngest and most vulnerable members. Okay, on that very deep and heavy note, I will say goodbye and see you in the next video. Bye bye.